Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the second shelf. It's the 1st of March. Yeah, the February doldrums, as Doris calls them, are finally over. But there's still one thing left to do with regard to February, and that's talk about my tops and flops of the previous month, the best and the worst of what I read in February. And as always with the tops and flops, we start with the tops, and as always within the tops, we start with the book that had me thinking the most after I finished it. And for this category, I chose Ellie Smith, How to Be Both, first published in 2014, which I hadn't read yet. But I remedied that in February. Yeah, me. Ellie Smith, of course, doesn't need an introduction, I suppose. A contemporary Scottish writer. I loved her seasonal quartet books, the ones that I've read so far. But sometimes I struggle with her experimental style. I didn't struggle in How to Be Both, but I can understand that some people had problems with the book, especially with one part of the book. But let me back up and tell you, if you haven't read it, what the book is about. The book is in two parts, and some editions start with one part, and other editions of the book start with the second part. One part is set in contemporary London and focuses around a teenage girl called George, who just lost her mother. She befriends a really popular girl in school, and they talk about art, but also about grief, about the mother, the last trip they did together to Italy. The mother died suddenly from a reaction to antibiotics, so it was a sudden death. The other part, that in my edition was the second part, is centering around a Renaissance artist called Francesco. Francesco is also a woman, like George, with a male name, and she takes on a male identity in order to be able to paint, which was not uncommon in Renaissance times, that women who wanted to paint, who had the ability to paint, took on a male alias in order to be able, to show their paintings. The book has, like most of Ellie Smith's novels, at least the ones that I read, doesn't have much plot. But the two parts are connected in quite a quirky way, which I'm not going to talk about if you haven't read it, because that would spoil your experience. But they are separate also, because they focus on different persons. They are about gender identity, for sure, because, like I said, both female protagonists have male names, and Francesco is pretending to be a male painter. But most importantly, they are about art, about looking at art, what it means to be an artist or somebody who is interested in art. And the part that deals with George is told in a relatively straightforward structure. The part about Francesco isn't. It's a stream of consciousness gone wild most of the time, certainly the beginning and the end. It's quite intellectual heavy. If you don't like that the book is probably not for you. But I loved it. I loved the discussions about art, about gender politics. Ellie Smith, in most of her books, somehow talks about art. And I just loved the experience. And it made me think about art, how we experience it, whether it matters that the artist is male or female, how our view changes over time, what we know about a piece of art or an artist. But it also, of course, made me think about gender identity, and certainly back in the 1500s, when female painters were often forced to assume a male identity. So for me, it was a fascinating, fantastic reading experience, and that's the reason it made the tops of February. The second book in the tops is the book that surprised me the most. And for this one, I chose a translated work by Japanese writer Yuko Tsushima. Child of Fortune is the English title. I'm not even going to try to tell you the Japanese title, translated from the Japanese by Geraldine Harcourt, first published in Japan in 1978, and the English translation in 1986. Yuko Tsushima was a contemporary Japanese author. She died a couple of years back, I think in 2016. She was famous and is famous in Japan. She won all the major prizes there, but I hadn't read her yet. I want to read more translated fiction, as you know, especially from, non-European countries. So that translated book was my pick for February. And why did it surprise me? Because Asian literature, Chinese, Japanese in particular, often baffles me. And I don't have, I don't understand it, which is never the book's fault, but my fault, because I know so very little, shamefully little, about that culture. But the Child of Fortune really grabbed me, also emotionally. It's set in the 1970s in Japan, in Tokyo, and the main character, Coco, is a 36-year-old divorced woman with an just about teenage daughter. She's 11. The daughter lives not with her mother, but with relatives, for reason explained in the book. And we follow Coco, who gets by teaching piano lessons, and we follow her and her relationship with various men, her ex-husband, her current more or less on and off lover, but also the relationship between Coco and her daughter are central to the book. And it really, it grabbed me emotionally for one reason or the other, which, I can't explain. I had to remind myself that the book was set in the 1970s, but the way the position of women and the expectations that society and family has for women, that was really fascinating. Halfway through the book, we learn that Coco is pregnant, and that takes the book to a whole different dimension, especially when we find out the reason or the origin of the pregnancy. I say that a little bit, that doesn't make sense maybe, but I don't want to spoil, again, I don't want to spoil when you find out about, the origins of the pregnancy. And that whole experience of Coco, especially about her pregnancy, I loved it. I loved the language. I can't, of course, tell you whether it's a good translation, but I loved the translation. And I really also learned something. So the book surprised me on many levels, and I certainly want to read more of Tsushima's work. And the third and final book in my tops is a nonfiction book. As you know, if you follow me, I want to feature more nonfiction on the channel, and if possible, also in the tops and flops. And this book was my best nonfiction read in February, a dual biography by Linda Hirschman, sisters-in-law, about Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The book was published in 2015. Linda Hirschman is a lawyer herself. She publishes nonfiction about women in law. She published a book about sexual harassment, for instance, and this biography, but also about the gay revolution. She was born, if you're interested, in 1944. And the book, Sisters-in-Law, about those two first female justices in the American Supreme Court, is law heavy. In other words, there's a lot of law in the book about cases, decisions. If you're not interested in legal things, then the book will bore you. You don't have to be a lawyer. I want to stress that and emphasize that in order to enjoy and understand the book. It's the law, the decisions and the cases that's really well explained, but you at least have to be interested in that. If you're not, don't bother with the book. Like I said, it's a dual biography telling us about the life of Sandra Day O'Connor, who was the first female justice appointed by Ronald Reagan in 1981. So we learn about her background, her life, and the same holds for the second female justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Both women are about the same age. Sandra Day O'Connor was born in 1930 and Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 1933. So they have sort of the same time frame in which they grow up, but they are also quite different. Sandra Day O'Connor is a conservative, a Republican. She was appointed by a Republican president. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is much more progressive, was appointed by a Democratic president, Clinton. But they also have common ground, certainly with regards to their position as women in the law, in their career, and in the Supreme Court. For those of you who might be interested, Sandra Day O'Connor was appointed in 1981. I think I said that already. And she was the only female justice for over a decade until 1993 when RBG was appointed. So it tells us something about the important cases, especially with regards to the position of women that were decided by the court in that period when both women, first Sandra Day O'Connor alone and then together when they served. And I find it fascinating. I find both women fascinating. I'm more a fan of RBG, you know that. I talked about another biography, Notorious RBG, in one of my last videos. But still, I find the first female justice, so Sandra Day O'Connor's career and her the way she made it into the top, yeah. What can I say? I find it fascinating. If you are at all interested in both women and or the law, this is a fantastic book, very well written, engaging, page-turning. It might be something for you. I can highly recommend it for sure. But again, if you're not interested in the law, leave it alone. Those were my top reads. On to the flops. And for this month, last month, the month of February, I only picked one. I had a couple of duds or disappointing reads, but there was one that I thought was so bad, it overshadowed all the other duds, and I also wanted to have some time to talk about the book, and it's American Dirt by Janine Cummins, published earlier this year. A couple of things before I get into the book. I won't talk about the controversy, whether Janine Cummins is allowed, quote unquote, to write. She's a white author to write about Mexican people trying to flee. I'm not talking about that. Also, there will be spoilers in my discussion. So if you haven't read the book and want to read the book and don't want to be spoiled, you shouldn't watch this. Okay. This book was really bad, but let me first tell you, for those of you who might not know, despite all the hype and all the controversy hype around that book, what it's about. It starts in Mexico, in Acapulco. Two main characters, Lydia, 30-something woman who owns a bookstore, and her husband and the 9-year-old son, Luca. Lydia befriends Javier in the bookstore. It's not really romantic, but sort of. But Lydia's husband is a journalist, and it turns out that Javier is the new big shot of a cartel, a drugs cartel. Husband journalist publishes a piece, and then the book opens when There is a vicious shooting attack during a family party, and everybody is killed, including the journalist husband and the rest of the family, except for Lydia and her son Luca. That's when the book opens. Lydia understands who is behind the attack, Javier, of course, and she and Luca flee through Mexico, first from Acapulco to Mexico City, and she wants to get herself and her son to safety to the United States because she is afraid that Javier will follow her and will kill her, will finish the job, so to speak, and kill her and her son. So that's the story of the book, opening with this a multiple murder, and then we follow the journey of Lydia and Luca through Mexico until they reach the US. That sounds fascinating and interesting. And I wouldn't have thought that you could have this kind of story and make it boring. But the book, first of all, was incredibly boring. It was also really, really badly written. I don't know what the editors did. Nothing, probably. But one of the things that really bugged me is that the author didn't have a grip on the point of view. She changes point of view from third person omniscient to third person in the head of Luca, in the head of Lydia, sometimes within a sentence, which is really bad writing. Again, my main thing was that the book was boring and the characters were like paper dolls. They never felt real at all. None of the characters. Lydia and Luca meet a lot of characters in their journey. Their sisters fleeing from other parts of Latin America. There's somebody who has connections with Javier's drugs cartel. There's a young boy who suffers from asthma, who's also on the run. So there are a lot of characters in the book, and none of them feels real at all. I gave the book one word review on Goodreads: trite. Yeah, I don't understand how you can write a book about such an incredibly important topic and also suspenseful, because these people try to save their lives and flee through Mexico, and make it boring. And whenever I was yawning along, then something happens. Somebody dies or some awful thing happens, and it felt like the author just had to jerk me awake in all this, my boredom and yawning. So even the events that were described didn't feel real. They felt like plot devices in order to add some suspense to the book. So yeah, I buddy read this book with Doris from All the Books, and we both were just flabbergasted how bad it was. And again, I'm not talking about the controversy that some people felt that makes the book bad already. I'm just talking about the book itself. It's just bad. Badly written, badly structured, boring, and absolutely lifeless characters. It was really one of the worst books I've read in a long, long time. Anyway, these were my tops and flops for the month of February. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, I'm looking forward to your comments, and I'll see you all soon in the next one.